Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Kevin Tallec Marston, and it is my pleasure as president of the Society for American Soccer History, also known as SASH, to welcome you to our October 2025 First Friday session. Founded in 1993, SASH works to promote, facilitate, and disseminate research into the rich history and heritage of soccer in the United States. You can find us best in two places at ussoccerhistory.org and on social media with our Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, X, and Blue Sky accounts. Please do follow the First Friday sessions at hashtag FFSS and post about them so that we can also post back from our SASH accounts. A reminder that the SASH website, which is maintained by Ed Farnsworth, has many excellent resources, including a growing collection of digitized resources ranging from archives across the planet and featuring fascinating clips of all parts of American soccer heritage. We encourage you to support our ongoing crowdfunding campaign to digitize more and more material and showcase U.S. soccer history. All of our sessions are available on YouTube and also as podcasts. Thank you very much to Brian Korstat for managing the podcast. Are you working on something that you might like to present at a future SASH First Friday session? If you are, please do reach out to the SASH board. All ideas are welcome from current and future members to be. If a shorter format would interest you to float some ideas, for example, that you might not be ready to present in a full 20-minute session, then we also do organize shorter sessions with several speakers. Or if rather than speaking, writing is more your thing, then we also welcome written contributions for the SASH website on all areas of soccer-related history. So please do reach out to us if you have any questions. If you are not yet a member, you can join SASH through our website. We welcome new members with open arms and friendly feet. Please visit our website and click on the Join SASH tab so you'll be eligible to receive our newsletter. Today, I would like to welcome our speakers who are going to cover the fascinating background and legacy of the 1985 first U.S. women's national team. You may have seen that they just celebrated a part of that legacy in Seattle last month on the 40th anniversary of the first official games played by the team. So to kick things off, I will turn it over to our former SASH president, Dr. Tom McCabe, who's based in London, where he teaches history at the University of Notre Dame in their UK campus, followed by Dr. Rachel Allison, who is also a SASH board member and associate professor of sociology at Mississippi State, and Jen Cooper, who is women's soccer historian and the NWSL stats manager, and also a former SASH board member. So thank you very much. Tom, over to you for discussion of the Little Earthquakes.
Thank you, Kevin. Everybody can hear and see? Wonderful. U.S. soccer legend Michelle Akers once told Grant Wall that the 1999 World Cup was a tsunami hitting the shore for women's soccer in the United States. But there had been seismic activity much earlier. Yes, there was a long line of women's soccer that led to this underappreciated quake, the formation of the very first U.S. women's national team, the 85ers, whose wild week at a tournament 40 years ago laid the foundation for one of the most dominant programs in American sports. Rachel, Jen, and myself told part of that story today, as well as address its legacy. I'm going to take about the next 20 minutes to take you through some slides. I had known about the U.S. women's national team through April Heinrichs, because she was the women's soccer coach at Princeton when Kirk Rudell and I met as 18-year-olds. There's Kirk on the left, I'm on the right. Kirk and I collaborated on Soccertown USA and Voice of the Game. And last spring, I said to him, hey, the World Cup is about a year away. Films are too expensive and too hard to make, but we have too much to say. What are we going to do? What about that podcast? Kirk, a Hollywood writer and a producer on shows like Spin City, Will and Grace, American Dad, replied, there comes a time in every man's life when he needs to buy a microphone. I guess now is that time. So I call it the intersection of history and Hollywood boulevards. Kirk can't join us today. He's attending a memorial service for a family member, but we're happy to report that we finished season 1 of An American Game. The investment in those 2 microphones has been worth it. We wrote and recorded 6 episodes, including little earthquakes. And before I get started, a brief note on sources and some of the folks we leaned on. There are journalists like Jerry Longman's Girls of Summer, Caitlin Murray's The National Team, Rob Goldman's The Sisterhood, plus Grant Wall's podcast on the 99ers, The Keeper by Dr. Kelsey Ervick, who made a SASH presentation back in 2023, the subtitle of which, Soccer, Me, and the Law That Changed Women's Lives. It's a graphic memoir, a wonderful one about the impact of Title IX and some of the other things that we're weaving into today, the Dick Kerr ladies, the suburban soccer boom, and college soccer. And finally, a new dissertation from Georgia Tech's Declan Abernathy. It's called Grass Ceiling, and it documents the decades-long fight of the U.S. women's national team for equal access and pay. So these are just some of the sources that we used to write the podcast. As you can imagine, as a History Society, lots of folks want to talk about the 99ers or even the 85ers who are getting their due on this anniversary. But what about the 93ers? Yes, that's right, the 1893ers. And thanks to Brian Bunk, who is on this call, he found women playing in San Francisco, and they are the earliest documented women's games on U.S. soil. They didn't lead to teams forming or league play, but the important thing is that there were some earthquakes, and they didn't create a tsunami, but they widened the fault lines for the women a bit in the U.S. And this included the Dick Kerr Ladies Tour in the United States in 1922. You can see the starting lineup when they played the New Bedford team from Massachusetts. It's talking about how big the crowd is, and British folks are there, but then other people who had never seen a game before. So it was definitely a spectacle, a curiosity. And then we see the 1971 Copa, where 110,000 packed the Azteca in the final. This is 1 year after Brazil won the 1970 World Cup on the men's side. And then we see the poster for the Mundialito, the Little World Cup in Japan in 1981, the very first one. And then it eventually moves to Italy and Jesolo, where our story will take place today. So think the Algarve Cup, an invitational tournament. There's TV. So it's a big deal for women at the time. So a lot of scholars, including the ones on this panel, are going to argue that the expansion of the women's game started with these small tremors of underwater activity. And then the real sea change comes in the shape of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. This is going to lead to Title IX, a law that prohibits sex-based discrimination in any educational programs or activities that receive federal funding. So schools and universities now have to provide equal access to all. So girls and women get opportunities, and school teams start popping up, club teams start popping up. So others had to force this change. In June of 1975, Pele came to the United States to play for the Cosmos. He's inspiring boys and girls of what gets called the Pele generation. I am a member of that generation. That same year in Northern California, a 9-year-old goalkeeper named Amy Love sued the State Youth Soccer Association. Title IX had yet to go into effect, and she'd been barred from playing in a boys' league. There was no girls' league at the time. Amy wins the lawsuit, and that December, she and Pele posed together on the cover of a new magazine, Soccer America. By the late 70s, there are thousands of girls getting access to youth sport, soccer included. It's the beginning of a nationwide phenomenon. Legislation and attitudinal changes matter. When Pele passed a few years ago, Amy Love posted the following on her LinkedIn page, and I quote, "Pele committed himself to helping children and building a worldwide love for the game. Along the way, he came to the aid of a 9-year-old girl, me, who earned a spot on an all-star team only to be told she could not play because she was a girl. His willingness to lend his global star power to me added legitimacy to our case and our effort to let all girls have the right to play soccer based on their ability, not their gender." End quote. Then we move on through the 70s and 80s, and the US, through this newfound access, is developing a dominant demographic of girls playing soccer. But there's no official US women's national team. There have been some regional teams, and there were paper teams, as you can see on the right-hand side here, from Mike Ryan's archive that is now in possession of Frank McDonald and the Washington State Soccer Association. But they didn't compete. It was just a list, almost like an all-star team. But that magazine, Soccer America, mentioned before, mentions in its June 6th edition of 1985, women's soccer will take a giant leap forward this summer. 3 weeks later, Soccer America noted that the USSF had hired a coach. And he immediately said, quote, "I'm a little vague on the details," end quote. It was US soccer, the 1980s, and a lot of things were vague. But that summer, 70 young women received letters from the Federation. Congratulations, you've been chosen to participate in the players pool. Please come to Baton Rouge, Louisiana for the National Sports Festival in 5 days. The National Sports Festival used to be a big deal. It was a competition for Olympic athletes in dozens of sports. Women's soccer had yet to be included in the Olympics, but pressure had been building to make it an Olympic sport. Marty Mankemeyer was a chairwoman for U.S. Youth Soccer, and she pushed the Federation to get women's soccer into the '84 Olympics. Remember that this tournament was massive for the growth of the game in the United States, leading to the World Cup bid, MLS, the women's leagues, and so on. That effort failed, but it got the attention of the Mundialito Cup for the women's national teams. The players in Baton Rouge were split among 4 regions: West, Midwest, South, and East. And an Irishman named Mike Ryan coached the West. Ryan was born in Dublin and moved to Seattle in his 20s. He found work as a welder, but also coached soccer, building the men's program at the University of Washington and becoming the first president of Washington Youth Soccer. The Seattle area was loaded with talent, and Ryan's club team had won 3 straight national championships. So his regional team was stacked with his players. That team beat the South in the final that year, a side led by Anson Dorrance, the University of North Carolina coach. After the final, the players gathered for the medal presentation, and then there were 17 golden tickets. 17 members would become the first official U.S. women's national team. They were called in front by Mike Ryan. He told them to be leaving for Italy in 2 weeks. So while U.S. Soccer expedited passports, they had to go home and pack and get themselves to Long Island, where there would be 3 days of training before they flew to Milan. They moved him to a dorm and had scrimmages against local teams. There was a cheerleading camp there that week, and they practiced on a manicured field while the national team trained on a cow pasture. Wonderful preparations. Okay, so we're now on the Alitalia 747 headed to Milan with the team. And this reminds me of the first U.S. men's teams, right? The last-minute passports were an echo of Jimmy Brown getting his citizenship on the boat down to the first World Cup in 1930. And Mike Ryan, pictured to the left here, carrying a bag of balls onto the plane, much like Tom Cahill with his bag of Spaldings on the boat to Sweden with the national team in 1916. The rhymes of U.S. soccer history. The players had Adidas gear, matching white collar shirts and blue tennis shorts. Some people thought they were a tennis team. They also had brand new uniforms, which were plus men's ones that volunteers and some of the parents spent the night before and sewing patches onto the sleeves. This was not Nike, nor a U.S. soccer marketing production. It was a classic example of lack of funding and support that women got in the 80s and beyond. And the men got support, but it wasn't, magnificent amounts of money either. Shoestring budgets, to say the least. They flew overnight and coach, sleeping on the floor of the plane, and they got to Italy the day before the first game to save hotel and travel expenses. The team arrives, tired and jet lagged, and went straight to bed. No, they didn't. They went straight to a parade. Then they had to play the very next morning. As the US anthem ended, the Italian fans started chanting USA, USA, USA. Some thought they were getting booed. Ooh, they weren't. Players said it was overwhelming. The stadium was rocking with foreigners cheering for the US. Hard to imagine that today. The team huddled up before kickoff, and that same player said, quote, I just took the moment and said, USA on three, and it stuck, end quote. It sure did. It's been the same for every U.S. women's national team game over the last 4 decades. The players and coaches change, but one thing has remained the same, the pregame USA chant. It's the tradition that started in 1985. The U.S. got a rough introduction to international soccer. As Michelle Akers, a young star on the team, said, quote, the Italians understood soccer nuances and cultural aspects of the game that we just didn't get. They bashed us in the face. They grabbed my crotch and yanked at everything, including my shorts, even my underwear. They pulled as hard as they could, stomping on our ankles and spitting on us when we were on the ground, end quote. Classic dark arts. The Americans picked themselves up and battled hard in the second half, even winning a penalty, which they missed. It ended 1-0 to the Italians. There would be more matches every other day, but that didn't mean it was all rest and recovery. When the girls weren't playing, they partied at local discos, took moped trips to Venice, and went to the beach. By the time the U.S. lined up against Denmark for the second game, some of the players were tired and sunburned. Still, the U.S. managed a tie, 2-2, with Michelle Akers scoring the first goal off an assist from Emily Pickering, and Pickering scoring the second off an assist from Akers. This is a bit contested because there weren't any official records at the time. After Denmark, more discos, beaches, and singing at the hotel piano before the next day, a 20-mile bus ride to face England. The bus driver gets lost and pulls up at kickoff. The referee comes to Mike Ryan and says, do you want some extra time for warm-ups? He says no. I'm not sure why, but the U.S. gives up 3 goals in the first 15 minutes, and the game is already out of hand. The U.S. would end the tournament with 3 losses and a tie, and that record may be part of the reason why that U.S. soccer doesn't memorialize them, or that they've been forgotten. They're not as successful as subsequent sides. But the other countries at the Mundialito were more experienced. Denmark had won the unofficial Women's World Cup in 70 and 71. And Italy, Denmark, England had all been to the Mundialito before. The Mundialito in 85 was Mike Ryan's one and only shot. Anson Dorrance was named the new head coach the following year, and he made some changes to the squad, like bringing in April Heinrichs, who had been hurt in 85. And an intensity that defined North Carolina soccer would soon define the U.S. women's national team. A year later, there were 2 more seismic events in women's soccer. First, at the annual FIFA Congress in Mexico City, held in conjunction with the World Cup, 145 male delegates gathered, and a sole female won. She was Norway's Ellen Wille, at 4'10", science teacher from Oslo. She was appalled at the lack of women's football in the annual report and said to the delegation, quote, I want a world championship for women. I want a women's soccer program in the Olympics, and I want common rules for all countries, end quote. She put the powers that be on the spot. FIFA President João Havelange punted to General Secretary Sepp Blatter, who stunned the room by saying, quote, I will accept the challenge, and you will see we will go for the organization of a Women's World Cup, end quote. A few months later, the U.S. women's national team returned to Jesolo for the Mundialito and beat China, Brazil, and Japan on its way to a final against Italy, which it would lose again 1-0. But if you're looking at a soccer seismograph in 1986, the needle would be jumping. The 1985 team didn't know how to play in a national tournament, but the talent was clearly there. The epigenetic history of women's soccer in the U.S., the boost provided by Title IX, and the courage of those 17 women who wore the USA shirt for the first time. They made the case that U.S. women's soccer could be what it became, and for that, we think the 85ers should be remembered and celebrated. Thank you very much. And I will pass it over to Jen and Rachel to make some comments.
Rachel, you want to go ahead?
Sure, I will. Tom, could you stop sharing your screen, please?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you so much, Tom, for all of your excellent work with the podcast episode. I listened to it this past week leading up to this session, and I really enjoyed it and look forward to seeing more from you on the podcast. Let me... All right. Can you all see the slides? All right, wonderful. So I'm going to kind of build a little bit on the history that Tom did a great job of covering for us of the formation, the kind of history of this 1985 team. But as a sociologist and not a historian per se, I think I will, reflect a little bit more not only on the current significance of this team, but also the significance of their recent recognition in Seattle. So as Tom and Kevin both mentioned, most of the 1985 team members were recently at an NWSL game in Seattle for a reunion called the Queen's Match. This followed up reunions in 2023 in Asheville and 2024 in Kansas City. And I think that there is a lot about these forms of public recognition that is worth noting. One of the most important things that stands out to me about Seattle in 2025, however, is that this reunion and moment of celebration for the team was also accompanied by their formal organization. And they have partnered with a company to produce 1985 team branded merchandise. They have a website. You can go and purchase this merchandise, including a 1985 jersey, which I think is very significant as a piece of merchandise, given that in 1985 for their first match, they did not have their own team branded merchandise, but were essentially given hand-me-downs. And so now this is also really the kind of first time officially the team has been recognized with their own piece of apparel. They also now have an Instagram account for the 1985 team, as well as accounts on other social media channels. And they've been highly active, both leading up to this Seattle reunion and then subsequently in the last few weeks. And to me, I mean, this is very important, not only in giving them a voice to tell their own story and reflect themselves on their history and their legacy, but also because of their historical invisibility. Both, of course, because they were not covered in mainstream mass media at the time of their play in 1985, but also because the fundamental nature of the media landscape has changed such that the types of very immediate options we have now in social media weren't even available then at the time. And so to see this team now kind of use these new kind of digital and social media tools to tell their story, a story that was not only invisible, but a kind of ignored at the time by media, to me seems particularly significant. I think what we're seeing then is that this team is getting forms of kind of public cultural recognition, but also material reward now for the contributions that they made in 1985 that they didn't have at the time and didn't even have in subsequent decades. And what I think is really interesting about this idea of legacy, which is something that I've explored substantially in my research on women's soccer since 2011, is just the recognition by members of this team that at the time of the team's formation and early play, they themselves didn't recognize that they would have a legacy, or that there was a legacy to be built from their participation in these first games. So for example, Michelle Akers told The Athletic in an interview that there were no expectations for the first women's national team because there was no precedent. There was no history. There was no legacy. And so we also, I think, clearly see that even the perspectives of team members themselves have shifted with time towards now recognizing the legacy that they have left and the impact they have had in kind of opening the sport for women and for the national team going forward. So In a lot of my research, I have interviewed many women's soccer fans, very passionate ones who are deeply kind of interested in the women's national team and also women's professional play, including in leagues past and present in the NWSL. And I went back for this presentation and to some of my interviews with the oldest women that I have spoken to, women who were born in the 1950s and 1960s. So, who were young adults at the time that this team first kicked off, to kind of reflect on their early experiences in the same time period, but also their pathways into following women's soccer. And one of the things that really strikes me about some of their narratives, and I include some quotations here from these participants, these, of course, are pseudonyms for women that I've interviewed, was just how much of a cultural lag there is between opening opportunities for women to take part in soccer, which, as Tom mentioned, really kind of began in the late 1970s through the early 1980s, post Title IX, leading into the formation of this team. But really, just truly how much cultural lag there was between early opportunities, but also then these opportunities as a springboard, not just to playing, but also following the team. So for all of the kind of older generation of women that I spoke to who were young adults in this time period of the team, they talk about themselves often using the language of pre-Title IX, that for them, the significant identity is actually that they were born and experienced their childhoods before Title IX in context of a distinct lack of opportunities in all sport, but especially in soccer. None of these women that I had interviewed, who lived in different parts of the country, had ever actually participated in soccer. And so talk about a lack of identification with the sport themselves, even at the time that the women's national team was being formed. Instead, many of these women only came to their fandom later in life, often through their children's participation in sport. So it wasn't until, for instance, the next generation began to participate more intensely that they kind of experienced soccer as a springboard into also following the women's national team. And they talk about, of course, tournaments, especially like the 1996 Olympics and 99 Women's World Cup. But there's absolutely no recognition among any of the people that I've spoken to in the last decade of the women's team in 1985 as significant in their experiences of soccer or their following of soccer. The one exception here is a woman I call Margaret, who's now probably in her 70s, was in her 60s when I spoke to her, and she did know the 1985 team only because her daughters had played in ODP programs with some of the women who joined the 1985 team. So she says, quote, "I knew all the national team players, and this is when, women's national soccer and world soccer was just really beginning to boom." And these women often, experience and report a sense of wistfulness or a sense of longing, almost a sense of regret at being pre-Title IX and not having opportunities, especially now seeing all of the exciting things going on in the development and growth of women's sport. So I think to me, one of the most significant quotes from Olivia here is like, "I predate Title IX. That could have been something too in me that's really deep down there. I could have been a better athlete. I'm 63 years old and I have never played a competitive sport." So while Tom kind of uses the metaphor of like a tsunami, I think reporting from Michelle Akers' use of that term to describe the impact of this team, I think the truth is at the time of its play, this tsunami was little felt, right? And it isn't until now in recent years, I think, that we've done the work to really uncover and make public the legacy and importance of this team. And I think these are really important forms of storytelling to kind of uncover the history of this team in new ways. So to see, for instance, in Seattle, the recognition, the celebration, but also the organization of this team for financial gain and resources, to me is so significant and meaningful in context of its historical invisibility. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jen, who I know has a lot of really interesting things to share with us too about how this celebration in Seattle came to be.
Well, that was great, Rachel. Thank you. for that. So I just have a few random points to kind of add, to what Rachel has said and add to all the great notes from that podcast. First, about that Seattle game. It was, Monday, August 18th, Seattle had a game, right? It is unusual that we have weekday NWSL games, but occasionally, depending on a broadcaster has a slot, it was CBS Sports, they had a Monday night slot. So when the schedule came out in, I guess that would have been February, and since I work very closely with league broadcast, I'm entering the schedule into my calendar. And knowing US soccer history the way that I do, when I got to August 18th, I was like, ooh, there's a game on August 18th. Yeah, I was like, and I immediately thought 40th anniversary. And I looked and saw where the game was, and I was like, and it's in Seattle. I was like, just so everyone knows, there was no planning, there was no intention. It was completely coincidence that there was a game on August 18th, right? Again, a Monday, very unusual, and that it was in Seattle. I immediately reached out to the Seattle PR team and said, just so you know, August 18th is the 40th anniversary of the first US Women's National Team game, and the first US National Team coach and about a third of that squad were from Seattle. And I mean, they immediately said, oh my God, we love that. And I didn't hear from them after that, but to see the rollout of everything they did around that match. And I can only guess that once they started contacting the 85ers, that put the other, the merch in Raleigh. But to see them embrace that game, to get all those people to come in, to brand it the Queen's match, and it's something that they're going to do every year. I was thrilled. And then to see a fan comment on Reddit, this made me so happy, where a fan said, oh, I'm sure they put this game on that date deliberately. And I'm like, no, they didn't, but I'm so glad that you think that they did. So that's my personal piece of that. But it was just, I loved that, kind of as Rachel mentioned, it really gave validity to that first group, and not just Michelle Akers, right? I remember very much in the coverage of 96 Olympics and 99 Women's World Cup of, Akers, she was on that first team. Akers, she was on that first team, right? You didn't have anybody else that was still around. So I was really pleased to see how it honored the team, how it was as inclusive as possible in terms of getting people out there. I think it's hard in this day and age with, the internet and social media, for us to remember that, there wasn't a lot of ways for information to get out, about this game. It would have been printed newsletters or printed Soccer America, right? I also, want to put it in context that, okay, that was the first ever national team games for the US women. For Italy, for Denmark, for England, their opponents, they'd all been playing well more than a decade, right? Sure, they're still not playing in a professional environment. There's still not a lot of money in the game, but these were teams that were regularly coming together, right? And as we mentioned earlier, the U.S. team came out of the players that played at the U.S. Sports Festival, which was later called the U.S. Olympic Festival. It is striking that there was soccer at those festivals when soccer was not yet an Olympic sport, right? We talked about Marty Mankmeyer. And, those players would come in and play on 4 teams, East, West, North, South. It was, think of it as the way ODP is now, regional, right? And Mike Ryan just, picking some players. I still think it's amazing that team happened, and we have to say held their own in Jesselo. They didn't win any games until the next year, right? But they scored and they impressed, and they got to test themselves against some fairly decent talent. And 1985 was the first year that US Soccer started giving a female Player of the Year award. the men's award had only started the year before. One of the things I run into with a lot of younger women's soccer fans is they assume that there was always money in the men's game. And I'm like, no. The 80s was pretty tough for the men too. The US women in 1985 got the same per diem as the men, $10 a day, right? There wasn't money in the men's game until after the 94 World Cup. And as Rachel mentioned, the 1985ers selling merch, I've always been kind of a merch junkie when it comes to soccer. So to see that, to see them owning it, and to see some more history filled out than just, 99 is that point in time. 96 still gets a little bit of, here's a significant moment. And it's interesting too that, okay, so you have this little earthquake in 1985, and it seems like US Soccer almost tried to erase it. I remember reading that Mike Ryan said he never got a call saying you're no longer coach. He just heard that, they had named Anson Dorrance. And as we know, and within a couple of years, Anson Dorrance had swung the team really young, right? He was looking long-term, because for any of these players, to put it in the context of the mid 80s, NCAA soccer was still really new. There had only been 4 national championships at that point. The NCAA tournament was a 12-team tournament. There wasn't anything to do once you graduated from college, so your pool was pretty small. Obviously, very, very different, from now. So those are my added thoughts to everything that's been said. And I do want to add that I did this summer find Denmark's match report for the US game, and so it is confirmed that Akers scored first. So I had always doubted that myself, because they didn't seem to be able to remember, but I found Denmark has a match report online for every game that they have ever played, which I appreciate. So I'll end with that.
Well, thank you very much to the 3 speakers for this wonderful, wonderful tour back to 1985 and through the legacy. Maybe now we would just go ahead and open it up to any questions and comments from everyone who is on the call with us today. So I don't know if anyone would like to kick that off with an initial question or comment or thoughts. And please remember to just give us your name and where you're tuning in from. Thank you very much. I think Michael, go ahead.
Yes. By the way, I discovered the U.S. women's national team in 1991 when they qualified for that World Cup. Wish I could say I was around covering them in '85. I'll say this: at the time, U.S. Soccer Federation was in chaos in 1985 for so many reasons. But I'm not being an apologist for them at all. Tough. 40 years later, what sort of recognition do you think this team deserved from the Federation? It just seemed like there's been a blip. Maybe I've missed something. I apologize. But I thought, forget about whether they won or lost. The fact that they were the foundation, that was the start. And I know we're all historians here. We understand history. There's got to be a start, a spark somewhere. But this is a question for Rachel, Jen, and Thomas. Feel free.
I mean, there's one simple fact. This team is not in the National Soccer Hall of Fame. And that was part of the reason, we did the podcast. James Brown, who's vice president of SASH, was like having some interaction on social media with the 85ers. And they're like, we should be in the Hall of Fame. So they, were kind of pushing their case. And I think that's where historians can play a role, right? Tell the story. Put them in their place in history. So,
but that's not U.S. soccer.
No.
Yeah, I mean,
but it would be a step along the way of.
Yeah.
But
I think the U.S. soccer part should come first. I mean, it's like it was a natural anniversary that U.S. soccer could have celebrated, and I was a little surprised that they didn't. And I'm sure it probably because it fell. They're like, hey, we're not doing any games, which isn't an excuse. they definitely need to be in the Hall of Fame. Of course, we all know how long it's taken to get, even all the 91ers in there. But I appreciate Michael's point of it needs to be coming from U.S. Soccer, because that amplification from U.S. Soccer is something that legitimizes a push towards the Hall of Fame.
Jack would like to add some history himself. Hey, Kevin.
Yes, Jack, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add something to the historical record. In 2007, the induction in Oneonta of Mia Hamm, Julie Foudy. The builder that year was, the veteran that year was Bobby Smith. And the builder was, oh, now we're struggling. But we invited the 85 team to attend that induction. Many of them did. And we awarded them as a team the National Soccer Hall of Fame Medal of Honor that year.
Nice.
And that's part of the historical record that seems to have been lost with the closing of Oneonta and however the powers that be carried the history forward. And Jack is calling from crossing the border between Maine and New Hampshire.
Thank you very much, Jack. I think you're highlighting one of the key problems of heritage and history to begin with, which is how things get lost and forgotten. Jen, you've mentioned how the role of governing bodies and national federations for promoting their history and cultivating it. And sadly, some of the facts that we know is that so many of these organizations are not focused on the past; they're focused on the present and the future. And it is, in that sense, part of the role of an organization like SASH and all of the wonderful members and people here to remember and to remind everyone what that history and heritage is. Because organizations are so unaware of their anniversaries. And, Jen, if you were able to bring that up just to highlight the connection between August 18th is fantastic. But those are the types of challenges that so many of the organizations face on a regular basis. And it also links kind of what you were mentioning, Rachel, earlier as well, about the role that that organizations have in saying what really was first. In this sense, it's the players themselves and the teams. Most of the time, people don't really recognize the significance of what they're doing. That is valid for all of us in our daily lives. And it's only retrospectively that we're able to place any significance on these things. And so in a sense, it's not surprising that in the immediate aftermath of 1985 that no one would celebrate that or recognize it. What is problematic, of course, is as Jack has said, when you had an organization that was responsible for that, and then they closed, and then the archive disappears for a while, and then it's resurrected, and it makes the process of preserving history and making heritage really, really complicated. If I can just pick up on one quick question for the 85 team. Does anyone know, because something I was trying to figure out was in the tournament in Italy and Jesolo, there was there's an England team that plays, but I'm unclear as to whether or not they actually played as England or as Great Britain. And this is I think also part of some of the problems of recognizing early England women's national teams as well is, did they play as England, did they play as Great Britain? And part of the fact that federations didn't necessarily want to recognize them, and so it was an easy way to create a national team using a different name. So I was curious if anybody knew about the other team playing there.
They were England at that point. That the England's women's national team they've been formalized for more than a decade, so they were not. Yeah, They were
I
being
don't.
just like the men and being like, England is separate from Scotland, which is separate from and I found a great history site for the England women's national team, and that's it's from what I've seen, it's since they formalized in 74, the only time they've participated as Great Britain is when they've had to for the Olympics.
Okay, I was just curious
and that's when they've actually included Scott's players on there. Yeah,
because some of the pictures I've seen have had a British flag, the Union Jack, and not the English flag flying, and so I was always kind of confused with that. Yeah, and even
use of that flag has been confusing over the decades as well.
indeed.
Yeah. I'll add one little personal note on the England women's national team. So a fella I play with every week, played with him this morning. He goes, you know, my aunt played on the Copa 71 team. She was the captain of England. So I said, would she come make an appearance in the class? And she did via Zoom. So Carol Wilson was in the military playing small sided, 5-a-side, 7-a-side, and it was co-ed. And she said there was this stranger watching, and he leaves. And basically she was picked out of there to then play 11v11 for the first time with the England women's national team. They qualified in some regional tournament in Italy, and then went to Mexico City. So it was like, you know, early days, you know, a decade before the US here. But and one thing to add, we get a coffee after that game in the morning, and I told them I was going to come on here. And when I said 1985, the US women's national team, their first official match, they were like, really? They said that was much older, much later than that they anticipated, right? They would have thought in the 70s or before, you know, some longer history because of the subsequent success, of course.
And that's where Title IX really came into play. It's that we had, once the soccer thing started going here, you had access to a pool of players that was playing regularly, you know, thanks to NCAA. I just dropped in the chat. So apparently the FA celebrated the 40th anniversary of the Mundialito in August because England won that tournament. So there's a nice article there. And then I found the 2007 Hall of Fame celebration newsletter. So there's a great picture. It looks like they said we celebrated the 85 and 86ers, but looks like a lot of 85 people in the picture.
And Jack, it was Alan Rothenberg who was the builder that year.
So does anyone else want to pick up on any other questions for our panelists, or make any comments or thoughts about the 1985 team and perhaps some of the legacy that has come out of that?
I'll add one snarky thing. I've always thought, wouldn't it be interesting to have a comprehensive history of a U.S. national team program, men and women, right? It's, you always see men's or the women's for whatever national team. And I started to think about that, and you would have the villain in that history would be U.S. soccer itself, right? At least for parts of the narrative, right? Where they're not, you know, it's chaos, as Michael said in the 1980s, or it was non-existent, or, you know, it would be an interesting way and somewhat adversarial at certain points because of, you know, lack of resources, lack of know-how, all sorts of things.
Well, I remember finding a story in Soccer America from 1994, which was the first year that they had a like the Nike US Women's Cup, where they brought in 3 other teams and, you know, did a round robin. That wasn't run by US Soccer. It was run by one of the 4, you know, divisions. I don't know if it was region 1, but whichever region hosted it, they ran the whole thing. They financially supported the whole thing, and they made money off of it. and kind of threw that back in U.S. soccer's face of saying, you're trying to say you can't do these things because you can't make money off them. Like, we just made $10,000 off this tournament, so it always amused me much later when when the U.S. women were fighting with U.S. soccer, and U.S. soccer saying, for 30 years, for 35 years, we have supported this team. Like, no, I think you should scale that back to 15, 20 years. Easy to revise history, as we all know.
History is just a pack of tricks we play on the dead people, right? Isn't that what it is? Just one quick thought, because I think Rachel and Jen, you both have some interesting legacy historical items, artifacts, objects that you might want to just share with us visually as well.
Well, if people can see, sorry, Rachel.
No, go ahead.
In behind me, I've got a 1999 street banner from the World Cup from Stanford. I remember I went to that semifinal. I remember seeing those street banners and thinking, oh, how can I steal that? Didn't figure out how to steal that. But a couple months later, they had basically a garage sale of, hey, here's all our leftover items. We're trying to clear them. If you want to buy them, buy them. So I bought a banner and all kinds of freebie stuff. But that's my prized possession for the '99 World Cup. And Rachel has a great one too.
I do. Well, in the very far back on the wall, I know it's blurry in my image, but is a 1999 poster that was made by U.S. Soccer. But this one is fancy because it was signed by Christine Lilly. So that's pretty cool. And also, to support our work here today, I have at my side 1999 Women's World Cup Barbie. Which I know Jen also has. So classic piece of memorabilia here with us today. Also in the corner of my desk, I have the little Megan Rapinoe. Here's Megan Rapinoe joining us today as well.
And not to be left out of the artifact party here, one of my favorite U.S. soccer artifacts is in the National Soccer Hall of Fame, and it is a banner. I think a triangular banner from the 1991 World Cup. And, it's
one of the ones where they exchange it, the captains exchange it?
No, this is some sort of signage that would have been on a pole or a fence or something. And basically a player must have grabbed it, or a U.S. soccer official must have grabbed it. And in Sharpie, black Sharpie, it says world champs on it.
Nice.
It was appropriated from China and then written on, and I just think that says so much of all sorts of things about the team, the role, the place of the game in the U.S. at the time, and the women. So yeah, that's one of my favorites. I noticed it. It's in one of the display cases in Frisco.
Well, and I have to add for the Barbie, she does actually have flat feet with cleats that come off. Her knees bend, her arms bend. I have the goalkeeper Barbie, and she can actually throw a ball and she can kick a ball. And came with like a Powerade water bottle and a towel. So it was an actual soccer player. It wasn't a Barbie that they just threw a soccer player uniform on.
Although mine also does come with a little hairbrush.
Oh, of course.
Well, it's interesting that in some ways, what I can't remember who made the point earlier, just about the importance of sporting results and how that influences how we remember things. 1985, they didn't win the tournament, right? So perhaps the influence of performance really is really key on remembering legacy. I know that, for example, was a really, really big stumbling block for the historical recognition of women's national teams in Australia, for example. They've only recently recognized their 1975 team as, quote unquote, their first national team. And, that would have been much easier had they won. But, if you don't win, people don't remember you as much. And so maybe that's another one of the lessons that we can take away from today's session is is the importance of how competitive sport really is. And the other bit, Jen, I think you mentioned this in terms of who was organizing the region, those regional gatherings, and it wasn't necessarily the National Federation. And how much of women's soccer history has also been organized not by the official pyramidal organizing body, right? That's a really interesting aspect to it. You always have people promoting. I mean, the something I would like to know, if any of the three of you know about the 1985 tournament, is who actually organized those Mundialito ones. Is it the same federation that was organizing the Copa 71 and the 70 tournament in Italy, or not? Because that was a completely different organization that was funded by Martini and Rossi, and I wonder if the 1985 tournament, I don't know who was behind that as well. I don't know the history of that at all. I don't know if anyone can shed some light on that.
Not
Well,
in terms of governing body, but RAI was broadcasting the games. So that was a big plus.
And there was no threat from FIFA that this was unofficial, and if any men's club offered their fields, they're going to get in trouble. And probably some of that was then wisely using the name Mundialito, right? Which I don't think FIFA was behind these so much as maybe they saw them, and that gave them the push to what they did in 1988. Before the first Women's World Cup, they had the FIFA Invitational in China, which was basically their test run for what if we did a full tournament for women. How would it be? How would it look on the field? Are there enough teams? Would there be fans? And so then 1991 was the first actual Women's World Cup, which they still didn't call a World Cup. It was Women's World Championship for the M&M's Cup, but that one, 91, was something you actually qualified for, as opposed to 88 was like, we're just doing an invitational. I think it was 12 or 16 teams, like just testing it out.
Any other comments or thoughts, questions from?
I was typing one in, and I'd love to ask. I can also sidebar it if it becomes a large thing. To your point, I'm sorry, you asked to introduce. My name is Remy. I'm a SASH member relatively recently, the last year, and I am chief historian and fan experience lead for Brooklyn FC, the women's team in USL Super League, starting in its second season. I really, in your point about that standard of you have to win to be remembered is like so starkly different between the women's team and the men's team that it just feels like it can't be the only place where like women are given a higher bar in order for that legacy to be remembered. And I was curious if there are other examples beyond that, sociologically or historically, where the record is, where those barriers are left to fall, where the women's side is less remembered, and where we still have to go on that front.
But I would also qualify that with pre-social media and post-social media, because we remember that the 91ers won. Who heard about that? I was a young adult at the time, didn't hear any about that. I had just started playing soccer, didn't hear anything about that. A lot of that was because obviously it wasn't held in the US, right? We weren't a soccer country. You didn't have pro league for men or women. It was happening at a weird time of year. It was the final was on November 30th, right? So I think you have to win to be remembered is a good point, but I think we also need to qualify it based on era, because I think about the 2011 Women's World Cup, the US women not winning their group for the first time, so they ended up playing Brazil in the quarterfinal. So their game was actually played late morning, as opposed to it would have been a 6 a.m. game if they had won their group. They would have played Australia, no one would have paid attention. Now, instead, they had a 10 a.m. game that went to extra time. Incredible goal from Abby Wambach, goes to PKs. They win that game, they win their semifinal. They lose in the final, but suddenly there's interest in the team again. And a lot of that, like at the time, that was the first time that something broke Twitter. Right. And I think a lot of that is the timing and the ability to get that moment out there, right? The Abby Wambach moment, and you know, the excitement of the final that went to extra time and then penalties again. And even though they didn't win, it had taken exposure to a level, and none of those platforms existed. Soccer wasn't a thing, you know, in the 80s in the US, except for, you know, a smaller group. So I think we always have to at least put it in context of its time period, where now I think it would be like, yeah, I think of it in the youth teams, the U20s, the U17s, you know, or even the US women in 2016 Olympics, you know, eliminated in the quarterfinals. It's like, yeah, we're not going to remember you.
That's so helpful. Thank you. The number of infrastructural pieces between the time of the game, social media existing versus not existing. I think of the Budweiser sponsorship that came out of the Women's World Cup a few years ago. Where like that actually led to the growth of that's a fascinating answer. It really is a thought-provoking answer. Thank you a ton.
Kevin, it's Jack. I wanted to thank Rachel and Jen and Tom for bringing back such great memories of meeting so many of those 85 players at the same time. And Tom, for your reminder that it was Alan who was honored as the builder. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for your presentation. I got to sign off, so just jumping in to say that.
Thank you, Jack, for all your work as well.
Thank you.
So I think we're pushing into extra time of our first Friday session. If anyone else has any other comments or thoughts or last bits, I know there's some bits comments in the chat, so that's great. Hopefully people are exchanging there as well. Does anyone want to have a final word, maybe for either from the floor, and then afterwards we could ask our three panelists to maybe just give us one final thought on the 85 and the legacy.
I'll lead us out with a chant, right? USA, 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 right?
Nice, Tom. I want to just make a comment that one of the things I found really fascinating as I started to look into the 85ers a few years ago is that a couple of them didn't even play college soccer. And not that they couldn't have, but there just weren't a lot of programs at the time.
I think to conclude us, I just want to offer a reflection from a sociologist's perspective that I know is mentioned briefly in Tom's podcast, which is just that, you know, reflecting on the legacy of 1985, I think it's also helpful to note that, you know, while this team was culled from the larger, you know, group of girls that were beginning to play soccer at the time, certainly in this time period, it was predominantly white girls that were playing. And so one of, I think, the changes since 1985 is just the increasing racial and ethnic diversity of the team, which I think is only positive. And so while we can recognize 1985 and celebrate it, we can also kind of think as well about who was part of that team, but also who didn't have the opportunity at the time to become part of that team.
And that's a great comment, Rachel. But I do want to add to that we're as diverse as the team is now, it's still coming from a very small sliver of who can afford to pay to play. Yeah.
Well, there's a whole nother topic, the historical structure of youth soccer in the United States. Now, there's a panel session. We'll have to schedule that for the spring of next year, I hope. So again, thank you to everyone who attended today. Thank you to our three panelists. And a quick reminder that we'll have another session in November, on the first Friday of November, and another session in December, which will be announced soon. So we look forward to seeing you online for future sessions, and please continue to be engaged and enjoy participating in all of SASH's membership activities and sharing all of the pursuit of the knowledge of history and heritage of SASH. So thank you very much and have a lovely weekend. Bye-bye.